The lock clicked uselessly in my frozen fingers for the third time. Nothing. Just the sharp, merciless wind of a Maine February cutting through my coat, and the slow, suffocating realization that my husband had changed the locks without telling me. My name is Natalie Brewer, and that was the moment I understood, without fully understanding yet, that my marriage had already ended long before I was locked out of my own house. I stood there on the porch, my breath turning into white clouds in the darkness, staring at a door that used to open for me without question. My fingers were numb, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. Inside, the lights were on. The television flickered softly through the window, warm, inviting, alive, and I wasn't part of it anymore. My phone buzzed in my hand. A message from Daniel. Maybe next time you'll come home when I ask, instead of working late again. Sleep in your car. I read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't feel real at first, like they belonged to someone else's life. Someone else's marriage, not mine. Not after 15 years. Daniel, I whispered, my voice barely audible against the wind. I called him. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. 23 calls later, I stopped. Not because I accepted it, but because something inside me, something deeper than anger, deeper than pain, had gone quiet, cold. I looked back at the house, my house, the one I had helped build, decorate, maintain, the place where I had believed I was safe. And in that moment, I felt like a stranger standing outside someone else's life. I turned away slowly and walked next door, my boots crunching against frozen gravel. Mrs. Hennessy's porch light flickered on before I even knocked. "Natalie Brewer?" she said, opening the door, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. "What on earth are you doing out here at this hour?" I swallowed. Daniel changed the locks. The words tasted like something broken. I can't get into my own house. Her expression shifted. Not just concern. Something else. Something heavier. "Come in, dear," she said quietly. "You'll freeze out there." I stepped inside, into warmth that didn't belong to me, and I had no idea that this night, this cold, humiliating, silent betrayal was only the beginning. I used to believe my life was steady, not perfect, but real. My name is Natalie Brewer. I'm 40 years old, and for most of my adult life, I built things for a living. Not with my hands like Daniel, but with numbers, timelines, and systems. I worked as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm. I managed deadlines, budgets, people who didn't always want to cooperate. I believed in structure, in reliability, in showing up. That belief extended into my marriage. I met Daniel Brewer 15 years ago at a community fundraiser. He was loud in a way that drew people in, confident, easy with laughter, the kind of man who made everyone feel like they mattered when he spoke to them. "You look like you're organizing the entire room just by standing in it," he had said to me, smiling. I remember raising an eyebrow. "Someone has to." He laughed. And just like that, we started. Back then, everything about him felt solid. He worked in construction, long hours, physical work that left his hands rough and his shoulders always slightly tense. He said he liked that I brought order to things. "You keep me grounded," he used to tell me. And I believed him. We built a life together, piece by piece. The house on Maple Street. The late-night dinners when he came home exhausted, boots heavy against the floor. Weekends where we sat on the couch, sharing silence that felt comfortable, not empty. I thought that was what marriage was supposed to feel like. Not fireworks, not chaos, but something steady, something you could lean on. But if I'm honest now, there were cracks. Small ones at first. Easy to ignore. Daniel didn't like how much I worked. "You're always late," he would say. Not angry exactly, just sharp around the edges. "I'm building something too," I would reply gently. "This matters to me." He'd shrug like that answer wasn't enough. Over time, those moments grew, subtle shifts. He started making comments about my priorities, about how a wife should be home more, about how other women made it work. I remember one night clearly. "I just don't understand why you have to stay so late," he said, sitting at the kitchen table, barely touching his food. "Because deadlines don't move just because I want them to," I answered. He leaned back, studying me. "Or maybe you just don't want to be here." That one stayed with me. because it wasn't loud. It wasn't a fight. It was quiet. And quiet things are harder to argue with. His family didn't help. His mother, Evelyn Brewer, had always been polite to me, smiling, welcoming, but there was always something underneath, something measuring. "You work a lot," she once said over dinner, folding her napkin neatly. "Daniel needs someone who's present." "I am present," I replied carefully. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Rachel, Daniel's coworker from the office, was different, too friendly, too comfortable. She came by often. At first, it made sense. Work conversations, quick visits. But over time, she stopped feeling like just a colleague. She laughed too easily at his jokes, stayed a little too long, looked at me like she was trying to figure something out. "You're lucky," she told me once, standing in my kitchen, sipping wine. "Daniel's a good man." I remember forcing a smile. I know. But something in the way she said it felt like a test. Still, I ignored it, because that's what you do when you believe in something. You explain things away. You smooth over discomfort. You tell yourself that long marriages go through phases, that distance is normal, that tension happens, that love adapts. And for 15 years, I adapted. I worked harder, tried to come home earlier, tried to listen more, argue less, tried to be the version of myself that would make everything easier. But now, standing in Mrs. Hennessy's warm living room, my fingers still tingling from the cold, I realized something I hadn't let myself see before. All those small moments, all those quiet doubts, they weren't random. They were warnings. And I had missed every single one. Mrs. Hennessy handed me a cup of coffee, watching me closely. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. I frowned slightly. "The lock? Tonight's the first time." She shook her head slowly. "No, dear," she said. "The other things." I felt my stomach tighten. "What other things?" She didn't answer right away, just looked at me, like she was deciding whether to tell me something that would change everything. And somehow, I already knew. Whatever she was about to say was going to break what little I had left. Mrs. Hennessy did not speak immediately. She lowered herself into her chair with the slow care of someone who understood the weight of what came next. The lamp beside her cast a soft yellow circle across the room, warming the faded floral upholstery, the stacks of old magazines, the framed photographs of children and grandchildren who no longer lived nearby. Everything around me felt domestic, safe, gentle. What she was about to say was none of those things. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at me over the rim. "The men who visit when you're at work," she said quietly. "The cars in your driveway that don't belong to you. The gatherings in your house when you're pulling those long shifts." For a second, I just stared at her. I heard the words, but my mind refused to let them settle into meaning. "What men?" Her eyes softened in a way that made my skin prickle. "Different ones, but Daniel's office friend Rachel is there often. And that real estate man, Damian Clark, he comes by a lot. Sometimes they bring others." My fingers tightened around the mug until my knuckles ached. "No," I said automatically, almost under my breath. "No, that's not..." "Not what? Not possible? Not Daniel? Not my life?" Mrs. Hennessy kept her voice calm, but there was no uncertainty in it. "I'm sorry, Natalie. I thought you knew. After a while, I told myself maybe you had some sort of arrangement. People have all kinds of marriages these days. But when I saw you out there tonight, locked out in this weather," she paused, "I realized maybe you didn't know anything at all." A strange ringing started in my ears. I looked toward her window. From where I sat, I could see part of my house through the darkness. Warm light glowed behind the curtains. Familiar light, my lamp, my living room, my marriage wearing its normal face. Inside that ordinary picture, something rotten had apparently been growing for months. "How long?" I asked. Her answer came too fast. "Months." The room seemed to tilt. "Months?" I repeated, and my own voice sounded far away to me. She nodded slowly. "Usually in the afternoons, sometimes earlier, sometimes they stay late. Daniel plays music loud enough to shake the windows. I've seen people laughing, drinking, men arriving separately, leaving separately. And there were times," she hesitated, "times when things looked wrong." I swallowed hard. What kind of wrong? Her mouth tightened. The kind a woman remembers because she wishes she didn't. I stared at the steam rising from my cup. My chest felt hollow. I thought about every overtime shift, every late meeting, every evening I had rushed home guilty because Daniel had sounded annoyed on the phone. You're never here, Natalie. You care more about work than your marriage. I can't keep eating alone every night. Those words had made me feel selfish, neglectful, ashamed. And while I was carrying that shame around like a stone in my chest, he had been opening our front door to strangers. I put the cup down carefully because my hands had started shaking. What exactly have you seen? Mrs. Hennessy looked uncomfortable, but she didn't look confused. That was somehow worse. I've seen women's shoes by the door that weren't yours, men in your living room, curtains not fully closed, Rachel taking photographs once. She looked away. And last week, I saw one of the men stumbling around your backyard in broad daylight. He looked disoriented, sick maybe. Rachel had to help him to his car. That made me look up sharply. At what time? A little after 3. 3 in the afternoon? Yes. I shook my head, trying to make it make sense. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe, she said. But the way she said it told me she did not believe that for a second. I stood up because sitting still was impossible now. My body was full of restless, electric panic. I crossed to the window, arms folded tightly over myself, staring at my own house as if I could see the truth by force. The porch I had swept last weekend. The curtains I had picked out. The front room where Daniel and I once sat with takeout containers in our laps, laughing at some terrible reality show neither of us admitted to liking. I remembered his hand on my knee, the casual warmth of it, the feeling of belonging. All at once, the memory turned bitter. Behind me, Mrs. Hennessy spoke again, softer this time. I should have said something sooner. I turned around. Why didn't you? She held my gaze, steady and unsentimental. Because marriages are dangerous places to step into from the outside. And because I am an old woman who has lived long enough to know that sometimes the truth angers the person who needs it most. I let out a breath that trembled on the way out. I wouldn't have been angry. Yes, she said gently, you would have. Maybe not at me, but at the idea, at what it meant. She was right. A month ago, even a week ago, I would have defended Daniel. I would have explained everything away with the fierce, embarrassed loyalty of a woman trying not to look foolish. Rachel is just a coworker. Damien is probably here for some paperwork. Those cars must belong to contractors. That music? Just a gathering. Just friends. Just harmless. That's how women like me get trapped. Not because we are weak, but because we are trained to interpret discomfort as misunderstanding. To give grace, to be reasonable, to stay composed while something quietly devours our peace. I sat back down, suddenly exhausted. And once I started looking backward honestly, I saw how many moments I had folded up and tucked away because they were inconvenient. The lipstick stain on a wine glass in the sink when I knew I had not been home all day. A perfume in the hallway once, sweet and unfamiliar, when Daniel kissed me hello and said I was imagining things. Rachel texting him late at night. His phone turned face down more often. His irritation whenever I asked simple questions. Even the way his mother had started watching me with that careful, pitying expression over the last few months. Had she known? Had all of them known? The humiliation came in waves, not just the betrayal itself, but the possibility that other people had seen the shape of my life more clearly than I had. Mrs. Hennessy set her cup down. There's something else. I forced myself to meet her eyes. What? She drew in a breath. The men don't always look fully steady when they leave. Not all of them. But enough that I noticed. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the weather outside. You think Daniel is doing something to them? I think, she said carefully, that whatever's happening in that house is uglier than an affair. The words settled deep. Uglier than an affair. That changed everything. Infidelity was one kind of wound. Brutal, humiliating, intimate. But this felt organized, deliberate, predatory. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it. No, I whispered. But it no longer sounded like disbelief. It sounded like grief. because some part of me had already started accepting that the man I married might not simply be unfaithful. He might be dangerous. I looked back toward the house again. The television light flickered against the curtains. I pictured Daniel on the couch, relaxed, comfortable, maybe messaging Rachel, maybe laughing at me standing outside in the cold. A strange calm moved through me then, not peace. Not forgiveness. Something sharper, more useful. If what Mrs. Hennessy said was true, then crying tonight would not help me. Neither would pounding on the front door. Neither would begging. I had spent 15 years trying to keep my marriage stable by being rational, patient, and measured. Fine. Then I would use those same things now, just not to save him, to expose him. I turned back to Mrs. Hennessy. "If I stay here tonight," I said slowly, "will you tell me everything you remember? Dates, cars, times, who came and went?" The corner of her mouth lifted. There was sadness in it, but also approval. "I thought you might ask that." I nodded once, because I was done being the woman left outside her own life, waiting for someone else to decide what truth I was allowed to see. If Daniel wanted to play games, then he had forgotten one important thing about me. I was very good at paying attention once I knew where to look. And by the time dawn touched Maple Street the next morning, I was no longer just a wife in shock. I was a woman gathering evidence. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in the narrow guest bed in Mrs. Hennessy's spare room, staring at the ceiling while the radiator clicked softly in the corner. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my front door refusing to open. I heard Daniel's message again. Sleep in your car. 15 years of marriage, reduced to that. But it wasn't just the humiliation anymore. It was what sat underneath it. The men. The cars. The afternoons. The word that wouldn't leave my mind. Ugly. By 5 a.m, I gave up pretending to rest. I sat up, wrapped my arms around myself, and made a decision. I needed to see it. Not hear about it. Not imagine it. See it. When I came downstairs, Mrs. Hennessy was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee like this was just another ordinary morning. "You're up early," she said, glancing at me. "I didn't sleep." She nodded, unsurprised. "Of course you didn't." I hesitated for a second, then said it. "I'm going back into the house." She paused, the coffee pot hovering mid-air. "Are you sure?" "No," I admitted, "but I need to know what I'm dealing with." She studied me carefully. Then she set the pot down and reached into a drawer. "I have something that might help." She handed me a small notebook, a pair of binoculars, and a thermos. I blinked. "You were prepared for this?" A faint smile touched her lips. "I've been watching that house for longer than you think, dear." Something in that sentence settled into me. I wasn't alone anymore. Not in this. By the time I crossed back into my yard, the sun had barely risen. The air still bit at my skin, but it didn't feel as sharp as the night before. Daniel's car was gone. Of course it was. He had gone to work, or wherever he went when he wasn't pretending to be my husband. I stood in front of the door for a moment, the same door that had refused me hours ago. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out my spare key, my emergency key, the one I had insisted on keeping years ago, just in case. The irony didn't escape me. The lock turned easily this time. The door opened, and I stepped inside. The warmth hit me first, then the smell. Not wrong, not obvious, but not right either. Something faintly sweet mixed with alcohol. Something that didn't belong to a quiet home. I closed the door behind me slowly. The house looked normal at first glance. Too normal. The couch was in place. The television remote sat neatly on the table. A blanket folded over the armrest. But when I stepped further in, I saw it. The chairs, pulled into a loose circle. Not how we left them. Not how I would ever arrange them. Like a space meant for gathering, for watching. For something that required positioning. My stomach tightened. I moved into the kitchen. 4 wine glasses sat in the sink. 4. I hadn't been home. Daniel had told me he spent the evening alone. I reached out and touched one of the glasses. My fingers trembled. "They weren't even trying to hide it," I whispered. I forced myself to keep going. Bedroom. That was where the truth would be. It always was. I pushed the door open slowly. Everything looked tidy, but again, too tidy, like a staged version of a life. I stepped closer to the dresser, opened the top drawer. Nothing. Second drawer. Still nothing. Then I opened Daniel's nightstand. At first, it looked normal. Cables. Receipts. A half-used bottle of cologne. But behind it, tucked carefully toward the back, I found them. Small bottles, unmarked. My breath caught. I picked one up, turning it slowly in my hand. The label had been scratched off. Another bottle, another. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. No, I whispered. No, no, no. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and started searching. Descriptions. Shapes. Colors. And then the words appeared on the screen. Rohypnol. Ambien. Xanax. My knees went weak. I sat down on the edge of the bed because the room suddenly felt too small, too tight, too real. This isn't an affair. The realization hit me all at once. This was something else entirely. Something calculated. Something planned. Something that involved control. And suddenly, Mrs. Hennessy's words made terrifying sense. The men who looked disoriented. The early afternoons. The loud music. I stood up again, forcing myself to breathe. Keep going, Natalie, I said out loud. Don't stop now. I checked the closet. There were clothes that weren't mine. Women's clothing. Different sizes. Different styles. Not guests. Not visitors. Not normal. Evidence. Then I found the cologne. Not Daniel's. Stronger, sharper, male, and not just one, multiple. I felt something inside me shift, not break. Not yet, but shift from confusion to clarity. I raised my phone and started taking pictures. Every drawer, every bottle, every item that didn't belong. If this was what I thought it was, then I needed proof, not emotion, not accusations. Proof. My phone rang suddenly, making me flinch. Carlos, my coworker, my closest friend. I stared at the screen for a second, then answered. Natalie, you sound terrible, he said immediately. I think I have food poisoning, I replied automatically. The lie came out smoothly, too smoothly. There was a pause. Then he said quietly, what's really going on? I closed my eyes. Then I said it. Carlos, I need you to tell me the truth. Have you heard anything about Daniel? About things happening at my house? Silence. Too long. My stomach dropped. Natalie, he said slowly, there's talk. My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of talk? At Murphy's bar. Some guys have been saying they've been to parties at your place. My chest tightened. What kind of parties? Another pause. Then quieter. The kind where married men go to forget they're married. I swallowed. But that's not the worst part, he continued. Cold dread spread through me. What is? They don't remember everything. Some of them wake up in their cars or somewhere else, disoriented. My eyes drifted to the bottles on the nightstand, and everything inside me went still. How many men? I asked. At least 6 that I know of. 6. Maybe more. I ended the call slowly, set the phone down, and stood there in the middle of my bedroom, surrounded by evidence of something far darker than betrayal. I thought I knew what it meant to be hurt, to be cheated on, to be lied to. But this was something else. Something that didn't just destroy a marriage. It destroyed lives. And as I stood there, looking at the proof in my hands, I realized something with absolute certainty. I wasn't just dealing with a husband who had betrayed me. I was dealing with a man who had turned my home into a crime. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't collapse onto the floor in some dramatic, broken heap like people expect when everything falls apart. I stood there, in the center of my bedroom, holding my phone, breathing too slowly, too carefully. Like if I inhaled too deeply, something inside me would shatter beyond repair. This is real, I whispered to myself. The words felt strange in my mouth, because part of me, some small, desperate, foolish part, was still trying to soften it. Maybe it's not what it looks like. Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe Daniel. I stopped that thought immediately. No. Explanations did not come in unmarked bottles of sedatives. They did not hide behind scratched-off labels. They did not leave unfamiliar clothes in my closet and strange men's cologne on my nightstand. They did not create patterns of behavior that neighbors could track for months. I pressed my lips together, forcing the truth to settle where it belonged. This was deliberate. This was planned, and Daniel had chosen it. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel it, not the anger. Not yet the grief. 15 years. 15 years of believing I was building something real, of defending him in conversations, of adjusting myself to fit into the life we were supposed to share, of ignoring the small discomforts because I trusted the bigger picture. I let out a quiet breath. I was wrong, I said softly. Not about everything. Not about love, but about him. That distinction mattered, because if I let myself believe I had been entirely foolish, then I would lose more than just my marriage. I would lose my sense of judgment, my ability to trust myself, and I refused to give him that too. My phone buzzed again. A message this time, from Daniel. You better not be making a scene about last night. We'll talk when you calm down. I stared at it. Then I laughed. It came out low and hollow, but it was real. Calm down, I repeated under my breath. He still thought this was about control, about punishment, about teaching me a lesson for working late. He had no idea what I had just found. And for the first time since this all started, that gave me an advantage. I stood up again, slower now, more deliberate. The shaking in my hands had eased. Not gone, but contained. I picked up my phone and continued taking pictures. Every angle, every bottle, every detail. I opened drawers I hadn't checked yet, looked under the bed, behind books, inside closets. I wasn't searching anymore. I was documenting. There's a difference. One is driven by panic, the other by purpose. When I finished, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked back one last time. This room had held so many versions of me. The woman who believed, the woman who adjusted, the woman who trusted. I could still feel her there, like a ghost I hadn't fully stepped out of yet. I'm sorry, I whispered. Not to Daniel, to her, because she had deserved better. Then I closed the door. I went back to the living room and stood in the center of it, staring at the rearranged chairs, trying to imagine what had happened here. The laughter, the drinks, the music loud enough to drown out anything that might sound wrong. Men sitting where I stood now, trusting, relaxed, unaware. My stomach twisted. They trusted him too, I murmured. That thought changed something. This wasn't just about me. This wasn't just about a marriage. This was about people being used, controlled, exploited. And suddenly, my role shifted again, from victim to witness. I walked back into the kitchen and rinsed my hands under cold water, watching them carefully. They looked steady now, stronger, more certain. Good. I needed that. Because the next step mattered. I picked up my phone and dialed Carlos again. He answered on the second ring. Tell me you're not still at home, he said immediately. I am, I replied. There was a pause. Natalie, what did you find? I didn't rush it. I let the silence stretch for a second before answering. Enough to know this isn't just cheating. His tone changed instantly. What do you mean? I said slowly. Daniel is drugging people. The line went quiet. Completely. Then, what? I found the pills. I found evidence. And what you told me, it matches. He exhaled sharply. Jesus, Natalie. I need your help, I said. No hesitation. No question. What do you need? I looked around the house again. At the furniture. At the evidence, at the life that had been quietly twisted into something unrecognizable. I need you to come here tonight, I said, and I need you to bring people you trust. For what? I took a breath, then said it clearly. To stop this. There was a beat. Then, I'll be there. I hung up. And for the first time since the lock had refused to open the night before, I didn't feel powerless. I felt focused. I walked back to the door, stepped outside. Locked it behind me. Not because I was afraid of what was inside anymore, but because I knew exactly what was inside. And tonight, I was going to walk back into that house, not as his wife, but as the person who was going to end whatever he had built there. By evening, everything inside me had sharpened. Not calmer, not softer. Sharper. Like every emotion, shock, grief, anger, had been melted down and reforged into something focused. Purpose does that. It burns away everything unnecessary. I spent the afternoon at Mrs. Hennessy's house, going over details, times, patterns, license plates she had written down over the months. Rachel usually arrives first, she said, flipping through her small notebook. Then Damien. The others come later. And Daniel? I asked. He's always already inside. Of course he was. I nodded slowly, committing everything to memory. By 6 o'clock, we were in position. Upstairs in her bedroom, curtains slightly parted, lights off. The binoculars felt heavy in my hands. Below us, my house sat quietly, too quietly, like it was waiting. At 6:28, headlights swept across the driveway. A car pulled in. Rachel. Even from this distance, I recognized the way she moved. Quick, confident, like she belonged anywhere she stepped. She carried a bag that clinked softly as she walked to the door. Bottles. Of course. She's early today, Mrs. Hennessy murmured. I didn't answer. I was watching the door. Rachel didn't knock. She let herself in. My jaw tightened. At 7:02, another car. Damien Clark. Same expensive coat, same casual arrogance in the way he adjusted his sleeves before stepping onto my porch. He glanced around once, then went inside. At 7:40, 8:05, 8:17, more cars, more men. Some I recognized. Tom Patterson from 3 houses down. A man from the hardware store. Another from the office park where Daniel worked. They arrived separately, just like Mrs. Hennessy had said. No one wanted to be seen arriving together. That detail sat heavily in my chest because it meant secrecy. It meant intent. By 8:30, there were 5 cars in my driveway. 5. I raised the binoculars again. Through a narrow gap in the curtains, I could see into the living room. Music played, not loud enough to reach us, but enough to see the rhythm of it in their movements. Laughter. Glasses raised. Daniel moved between them easily, relaxed, comfortable. Like this was normal. Like this was routine. Like this was his life. I felt something twist deep inside me, but it didn't pull me apart. It tightened me, focused me. There, Mrs. Hennessy whispered. I followed her gaze. Tom Patterson. He was sitting near the edge of one of the chairs. At first, he looked fine, talking, smiling. Then, something shifted. His posture slumped slightly. His head tilted. He blinked too slowly. I leaned closer, my breath catching. Watch his hands, I whispered. They weren't steady. He reached for his glass again, missed slightly, corrected, then tried to stand. His knees buckled. He sat back down, hard. My grip on the binoculars tightened. She's doing it now, I said. My voice sounded calm, but it wasn't. It was controlled. There's a difference. Beside him, Rachel leaned in, saying something I couldn't hear. Daniel stood across the room, watching, not concerned, not surprised, watching. Like he was waiting for it, for the effect, for the moment. A second man started rubbing his eyes. Another leaned back too heavily in his chair. The room was changing, and none of them knew it. I lowered the binoculars slowly. They're already sedated. Mrs. Hennessy looked at me. What are you going to do? I didn't hesitate. I'm ending it. I reached for my phone. Dialed Carlos. He picked up immediately. We're outside, he said. Me, Mike, Steve, we've got your back. I looked out the window. 3 men stood near the edge of the street, solid, steady, waiting. Come to the front, I said. I'll go through the back. You sure? Yes. I hung up. Turned to Mrs. Hennessy. Call the police, I said, but not yet. Give me 5 minutes. She nodded once. You be careful. I held her gaze for a second, then said quietly, I will. I moved quickly. Down the stairs, out the back door, across the yard. Each step felt louder than it was. My heart pounded, but not wildly, rhythmically, like it was keeping time with something inevitable. The back door. My key slid into the lock, turned, opened. I stepped inside. The smell hit me again. Wine. Something sweet. Something wrong. Voices filled the air. Laughter. Low music. And underneath it, something heavier. I moved forward. 1 step. 2. Then into the living room, and everything stopped. The scene was worse up close. 3 men slumped in chairs, barely conscious. Rachel moving between them, a phone in her hand. Camera open. Damien crouched near one of them, going through his wallet, taking pictures, credit cards, IDs. Systematic, efficient. Daniel stood near the center of it all, holding a glass, watching. My husband, the man I had built 15 years of life around. Stop. My voice cut through the room. Everything froze. Rachel turned first, then Damien, then Daniel. His face shifted, fast. Surprise, annoyance, calculation. Natalie, he said, you're supposed to be at work. I stepped forward slowly. I live here, I said. The words landed heavier than I expected, because suddenly, they weren't just about the house. They were about everything he had tried to take from me. Behind me, the front door opened. Carlos, Mike, Steve. They stepped in quietly, closing the space. The conscious men tried to stand, failed. Tom Patterson looked at me, eyes glassy. Natalie, what's happening? I feel you've been drugged, I said. The room went silent. Rachel shook her head quickly. That's not... Don't, I cut her off. My voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. I pulled out my phone. Hit record, then looked directly at Daniel. I want you to explain to me, I said slowly, what exactly is happening in my house. He stared at me. And for the first time in 15 years, he didn't look like he had control anymore. For a few seconds after I spoke, no one moved. Not Rachel. Not Damien. Not even Daniel. It was like the entire room had forgotten how to function without the illusion they had been living inside. Then Daniel exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with a soft click. You're overreacting, he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Like this was a minor inconvenience. Like I had just walked in on something embarrassing, not criminal. I stared at him. Say that again? You're making this into something it's not, he continued, gesturing vaguely around the room. These are adults. They came here willingly. They're drinking, having a good time. Behind him, Tom Patterson tried to lift his head again. Failed. His body slumped further into the chair. My chest tightened. A good time? I repeated. Rachel stepped forward quickly, her tone defensive. We didn't force anyone to be here. No, I said quietly. You just made sure they couldn't leave. That landed. I saw it in the flicker across her face, in the way Damien suddenly avoided my eyes, in the way Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly. I stepped closer. 1 step. Then another. Do you even hear yourselves? I asked. Do you see them? I gestured toward the men. Their bodies. Slack. Unresponsive. Vulnerable. You drugged them. We didn't, Rachel started again. Stop lying. My voice cracked this time. Not loudly, but enough. Enough for the room to feel it. For a moment, everything inside me threatened to break. Because this wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was violation of trust. Of safety, of something deeper I didn't even have words for yet. And standing in the middle of it was my husband. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him. Not the man I married. Not the version of him I had defended for years. The man in front of me. The one who had watched men lose control of their own bodies in our living room and called it normal. Why? I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. Not strategic. Not controlled. Just human. Why would you do this? For the first time, he hesitated, just a fraction. Then his expression hardened. You wouldn't understand. Something inside me went very, very quiet. Try me. He scoffed lightly, shaking his head. You were never here, Natalie. You were always working, always choosing everything else over this marriage. My stomach twisted. That's what this is about? I asked, disbelief creeping in. This is about you not being around? You think I'm the problem? He shot back, his voice rising slightly now. I was alone in this house every night. Do you know what that feels like? Yes, I said softly. The words surprised even me, because suddenly I did. I had just been standing outside this house, locked out, alone. But unlike him, I hadn't filled that emptiness by destroying other people. So you decided to do this, I continued? To turn our home into what? A business? A game? We're not hurting anyone, Rachel snapped. I turned to her slowly. They don't remember what happens here. They don't need to, she shot back. That was the moment. The exact moment when something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Because I realized something I had been resisting since the night before. There was no misunderstanding, no explanation, no version of this where they were confused or misguided or made a mistake. They knew, and they didn't care. I let out a breath, long, slow. And when I spoke again, my voice was different, not shaking, not emotional, just clear. You're taking photos, I said, looking at Damien now, of their wallets, their IDs. He froze. I saw you, I continued, and I've already documented everything in this house. Daniel's head snapped toward me. What? I held up my phone slightly. Every bottle, every drawer, every piece of evidence. Rachel's face paled. Damien took a step back, and Daniel, for the first time, actually looked uncertain. This doesn't have to go any further, he said quickly, stepping toward me. We can handle this, privately. I almost laughed. Privately. Like everything they had done hadn't already crossed every possible line. Privately? I repeated. Behind me, Carlos shifted slightly. The room was no longer balanced. Not in their favor. Not anymore. I looked back at Daniel, and I saw it. Really saw it. Not just what he had done, but who he was. The manipulation, the justification, the complete absence of accountability. 15 years. And I had never truly known him. That realization hurt more than anything else, more than the betrayal, more than the humiliation, because it meant everything I had built my life on had been an illusion. And standing there, in the middle of that shattered illusion, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, not even grief, just emptiness. A hollow space where something important used to live. I don't know you, I said quietly. The words landed heavier than anything else I had said. Daniel flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. And for a second, I wondered if that hurt him, if that reached something real. Then he spoke again. You're being dramatic. And just like that, whatever tiny part of me had still been hoping, even unconsciously, that there was something left worth saving, disappeared completely. I nodded slowly. Not in agreement, in acceptance. This is who you are, I said. Not a question, a statement. And in that moment, standing in a room full of evidence, surrounded by people who had chosen to harm others, I reached the lowest point of my life. Not because I had been betrayed, but because I had finally understood that the man I loved had never truly existed. Silence filled the room after my last words. Not the heavy, suffocating kind. Something sharper, like the air itself had shifted direction. Daniel stood there, watching me carefully now. Not dismissive anymore. Not confident. Measuring. Calculating. For the first time since I walked in, he realized something had changed. Not the situation. Me. Natalie, he said, his tone softening, stepping closer. Let's just talk about this. You're upset. I get it. But we can fix this. Fix. That word almost made me smile. 15 years, and he still thought everything was something to manage, to adjust, to spin. I looked at him steadily. No, I said. Simple. Final. He paused. You don't mean that. I do. Rachel shifted beside him. You're blowing this out of proportion. No one here is even hurt. Behind her, one of the men let out a weak groan. His head rolled to the side. Unconscious. I didn't take my eyes off Daniel. They were drugged, I said. They drank, he corrected quickly, with substances they didn't consent to. He didn't respond because he couldn't. Because this time, there was no angle left. No version of the story where he came out clean. And he knew it. That was the moment the power shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But completely. I stepped forward. One step. And he stepped back. Just slightly. But enough. Enough for me to see it. You said I wouldn't understand, I continued, my voice calm. You're right. I held his gaze. I don't understand how someone can look at another human being and decide they don't deserve control over their own body. Rachel let out a frustrated breath. Oh my God, you're acting like we kidnapped them. No, I said, finally turning to her. You did something worse. She blinked. You made them trust you first. That hit. I saw it. In the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way she looked away. Because that was the truth they couldn't hide behind language. This wasn't force. It was deception. And that made it deeper, more dangerous. I turned back to Daniel. And you let it happen in our home. Our home, he repeated, his tone shifting again, defensive now. You barely live here, Natalie. I didn't react, not the way he expected, because I wasn't inside that argument anymore. I was outside it, looking at it clearly. That house stopped being ours the moment you turned it into this, I said. He opened his mouth to respond, but the front door opened again. And this time, it wasn't Carlos. It was Mrs. Hennessy, followed by two neighbors, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Martinez. They stepped in slowly, taking in the scene, the men, the phones, the tension. Mrs. Hennessy's eyes met mine, and in them, there was something steady, support, truth. You called them? Daniel snapped. I asked for witnesses, I replied. Not backup, not help, witnesses. That word landed differently because suddenly, this wasn't just a private confrontation. This was exposure, real. Irreversible. Daniel's composure cracked just a little more. You're making a mistake, he said sharply. You don't want to do this. I tilted my head slightly. Don't I? He stepped closer again, lowering his voice. You think this ends well for you? You think dragging this out publicly won't destroy everything? I held his gaze, and for the first time, I understood exactly what he meant. Not fear, not warning, a threat. Subtle, but real. And something inside me locked into place. No, I said quietly, this ends well for me. He froze. Because I believed it, not as hope, as fact. I turned slightly, addressing the room now. All of you, I said, look at them, the men. Unsteady, unaware. Look at what's happening here. No one spoke. Because no one could deny it anymore. Not with this many eyes. Not with this much evidence. I raised my phone slightly. I have everything documented, I continued. The drugs, the setup, the messages. Rachel's face drained of color. Damien shifted again, clearly calculating escape routes. But there weren't any left. Police are on their way, Mrs. Hennessy said calmly. That was it. The final piece. The line that separated before from after. Rachel turned to Daniel, panic breaking through. You said this wouldn't happen. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. Because control, the thing he had relied on for months, was gone. And in its place was consequence. I stepped back. Creating distance, physical, emotional, final. I'm done, I said, not loudly, not dramatically, just true. Daniel stared at me. You're walking away from 15 years? I shook my head slowly. No, I said. I'm walking away from what you made those 15 years mean. That was the difference, and we both knew it. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Getting closer, Rachel started pacing. Damien muttered something under his breath. The room was no longer controlled. It was unraveling, and I stood in the center of it, completely still, because the hardest part had already happened. Not the confrontation, not the exposure, the realization, the moment I stopped asking why and started deciding what now. And now, I knew exactly what came next. Not revenge, not chaos, just truth. And the quiet, unshakable decision to never belong to this version of my life again. The sirens grew louder, closer, until they were no longer something in the distance, but something arriving, final, unavoidable. Inside the living room, no one spoke anymore. Not Rachel, not Damien, not Daniel. The illusion had already shattered. Now, all that remained was what came after. The consequences. The front door opened. Police. Paramedics. Authorities stepped into the space that had once been my home. And just like that, it no longer belonged to Daniel or to the lie he had built. A detective, mid-50s, tired eyes, the kind of man who had seen too many versions of this, took one look at the room and his expression hardened. What's going on here? I stepped forward. Not rushed, not emotional, just clear. They've been sedating these men, I said, without consent. The words landed clean, precise. No hesitation. Behind me, Rachel let out a sharp breath. That's not... Save it, the detective cut her off. He didn't even look at her yet. His attention stayed on the men, on the evidence, on reality. Paramedics moved quickly, checking pulses, lifting eyelids, asking questions that got no real answers. Tom Patterson reached for my arm weakly as they helped him up. Natalie, I don't feel right. I know, I said gently. You're going to be okay. My voice softened for him because he deserved that, because he hadn't chosen this. He swallowed hard. My wife, she can't. We'll handle it, I said quietly. Not a promise, but a direction. The detective turned to me again. You live here? Yes. And them? My husband, I said, nodding toward Daniel. The word felt strange now. Heavy. Temporary. And his associates. That was more accurate. Daniel stepped forward quickly. Detective, this is a misunderstanding. My wife is upset. Sir, the detective said flatly. You're going to stop talking. Daniel froze. Because this wasn't me anymore. This wasn't a conversation he could steer. This was a system he couldn't control. Officers began moving through the house, opening drawers, collecting bottles, photographing everything. The same things I had seen that morning. But now, official, documented, real in a way that could not be denied. Rachel's composure cracked first. This isn't supposed to... She started, her voice shaking. You didn't mean what? I asked quietly. She looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't look confident. She looked afraid. Damien tried to edge toward the hallway. An officer stepped in his path immediately. Stay where you are. The command was simple, absolute. Daniel turned back to me. This is unnecessary, he said, his voice lower now, tighter. You didn't have to do this. I held his gaze. Yes, I said, I did. Because this was the part he still didn't understand. This wasn't escalation. This was correction of something that should have never been allowed to exist. The next hours blurred together. Statements, questions, evidence, names written down, details repeated. But through all of it, I stayed steady. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt no longer controlled me. By the time they took Daniel away, he looked different, not defeated. Not yet, but stripped of certainty, of control, of the narrative he had been living inside. Rachel followed soon after, crying now. Damien tried to maintain composure, but his eyes gave him away. Fear. Real. Raw. Deserved. And when the house finally emptied, when the flashing lights faded, when the noise disappeared, I stood alone in the living room, the chairs still in that circle, the air still carrying traces of what had happened. But something was different. It didn't feel like his space anymore. It didn't feel contaminated. It felt over. Carlos stepped up beside me quietly. You okay? He asked. I thought about it. Really thought about it. Then I nodded. Yes. And for the first time, that wasn't a lie. The days that followed unfolded exactly how they needed to. Not easy, but clear. The truth spread, not because I pushed it, but because it couldn't stay hidden anymore. The men who had been drugged, once they recovered, began to understand what had happened to them. Their wives found out. Not through gossip, through facts, through evidence, through something undeniable. Some of them broke. Some of them fought. Some of them tried to hold their marriages together, but none of them remained untouched. Rachel's husband left her immediately, took their children. No discussion, no negotiation. Damien's wife filed for divorce within days, froze their accounts, forced him out of their home. Daniel had no one left to manage, no one left to manipulate. His mother called me once, voice tight, controlled. This didn't have to go this far, she said. I listened. Then answered calmly, it already had. She didn't call again. Good. because I was no longer interested in being understood by people who had never tried to see clearly in the first place. 3 weeks later, I filed for divorce. Not quietly, not aggressively, just completely. Everything documented, everything supported, everything undeniable. Daniel tried to reach out. Messages, calls, through friends, through lawyers. We can fix this. We can come to an agreement. Don't ruin both our lives. I didn't respond because this had never been about ruin. It had been about truth. And truth, once exposed, doesn't go back into hiding. I stood one evening in the living room again. The same room, but different now. The chairs were gone. The air was clean. The silence, peaceful, not empty, free. Mrs. Hennessy stood beside me, holding her coffee. Well, she said softly, that's the end of that. I looked around, then nodded. No, I said. It's the beginning of something else. And for the first time in 15 years, I knew exactly what that meant. It meant I was no longer living inside someone else's version of my life. I was standing in my own, uncompromised, uncontrolled, mine. 6 months later, I was standing in my backyard with my hands in the soil. The air was softer now. Spring had replaced the brutal cold of that February night, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe without something tightening in my chest. I pressed a small plant into the ground carefully, brushing dirt over its roots. Simple, grounded, real. Not like the life I had been living before. That life had been structured, organized, controlled. But underneath it, something had been rotting for a long time. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Natalie, Mrs. Hennessy's voice called from behind me. I turned slightly. She stood at the edge of the yard, her usual cup of coffee in hand, watching me with that quiet, knowing expression. You look different, she said. I smiled faintly. I am different. And I meant it. Not stronger in the dramatic sense. Not hardened beyond recognition. Just clearer. The divorce had been finalized 2 months ago. Clean. Efficient. There was nothing left to fight over, because in truth, there was nothing left worth keeping. The house stayed with me, not as a symbol of what I lost, but as proof of what I survived. Inside, everything had changed. The living room, once a place where something dark had taken root, was now open, bright, rearranged on my terms. The bedroom no longer carried ghosts. I had removed every trace of him, not out of anger, but out of respect for myself. Daniel had tried to contact me again after the charges were filed. Letters. Apologies. Excuses disguised as explanations. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was under pressure. You weren't there for me. I read one. Just one. Then I folded it carefully and threw it away because I understood something now that I hadn't understood before. Closure does not come from the person who hurt you. It comes from what you choose to accept and what you choose to leave behind. The case moved forward. Evidence. Testimonies. Facts that couldn't be reshaped or softened. Daniel was convicted. Rachel too. Damien followed. Their lives didn't just change, they collapsed. Not because I destroyed them, but because the truth removed the structure that had been holding their lives together. That distinction mattered to me because I hadn't acted out of revenge. I had acted out of refusal. Refusal to stay silent. Refusal to be complicit. Refusal to let something wrong continue just because it was uncomfortable to confront. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stood up fully. Mrs. Hennessy stepped closer, handing me a cup of coffee. Any regrets? She asked. I thought about it. Not quickly, not lightly. I let the question settle. Then I shook my head. No, because regret implies that I would choose differently if I had the chance again, and I wouldn't. Not a single step, not even the pain. Especially not the pain, because the pain had forced me to see clearly, to stop explaining things away, to stop shrinking myself to fit into something that was quietly destroying me. I looked out at the yard, at the small changes I had made, at the life I was rebuilding. Not from scratch, but from truth. I used to think strength meant holding things together, I said slowly. Mrs. Hennessy listened without interrupting. Now I think it means knowing when to let something fall apart, because it was never meant to hold you in the first place. She smiled. A soft, approving smile. That's a hard lesson to learn. Yes, I said. It is. There are still moments, quiet ones, when I think about the woman I used to be, the one who stood outside in the cold, staring at a locked door, still hoping there was something inside worth saving. I don't judge her. I don't feel ashamed of her. I understand her. Because she loved, because she believed, because she tried. And those things are not weaknesses. They are qualities that simply need to be given to the right person, not someone who sees them as something to use. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. I took a sip of my coffee. Warm, steady, real. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't waiting for anything to change. I wasn't hoping for clarity. I wasn't questioning what I had missed. I already knew. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. The first time, not the second. Not after it breaks you. The first. Because the truth doesn't hide. It waits. And when you finally see it, you have a choice. Stay in it or walk away. I chose to walk away. And in doing that, I didn't lose my life. I got it back.